Hello, tonight we have some Bigfoot stories for you. Enjoy them and don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Tales of Dread. On the night of June 12, 2021, my husband and I saw what we think was a Sasquatch. When we turned onto our street, it was about 9:30 p.m. and we were driving home with our daughter. Keep in mind that we live in the middle of nowhere, a long way from Lawrenceburg, Tennessee. My husband turned the wheel just a little bit to turn onto our street. There was a figure of an animal with its fingers touching something on the ground and picking at it with its fingers. When the animal saw that our headlights were turning, it ducked under them on purpose. It was right in front of our car, about 5 feet away. When we turned toward it at one point, it was right in the headlights. The animal then ran across the yard of our neighbor. It didn't run on 2 feet like a person does. We thought it was a gorilla at first. At first, its movements looked a lot like those of a person. It jumped up and down with its front legs like a gorilla, but because its arms were so long, it moved so fast that it was crazy. We did think it could have been a person in a hairy costume, but it moved too fast for it to be a person. It was not a bear, for sure. It looked more like a gorilla or a person with hair all over their body. It had dark brown or black hair all over it. The animal ran across our neighbor's 252 by 300 foot grass lawn and was gone in about 6 seconds. Our 4-year-old daughter was playing on her iPad and did not see the animal. When we got to our home, after a minute, I was scared to get out of the car. We didn't know what we'd seen. And because it was going so fast, it could have turned around and been at our house in about 10 seconds. I worked up the courage to run to my house door and unlock it as everyone else ran inside. We were scared to death. We saw the animal together. But my husband was the one who saw it. He said it had fingers and was looking at something on the ground. I didn't catch that. I just saw the part where it started to run. When it got past our neighbor's lawn, we thought it might be a bear, but it was too much like an ape to be a bear. It was too fast and skinny, and it didn't run on all fours the way a bear would have, and it walked on 2 legs more easily than a bear would. This happened in a part of Washington state in the summer of 2017. Our group was made up of 4 people who camped for free for the night. I don't remember the exact date, but it happened at the end of August 2017. In the whole campground, there was only one trailer, which was occupied by a family with 2 young children. We weren't too tense. I got the short end of the stick and had to sleep in the back of one of our cars. The campground is way out in the middle of nowhere. There is no cell phone service, and there is only one road that runs along a river. It is also in an area where cattle are free to roam. We spent the day going to the river and playing games. We spent the night by the fire. We all go to our sleeping areas, which is a typical camping scene. I was sleeping in the back of a Jeep at about 3 a.m. when I heard rustling outside. The windows were down and the door was open. I sat up and looked out the window because it was completely dark outside. They were hunched over the picnic table and looked through our things for trash. Yes, I'm aware of all the things that could happen. We left our trash out where raccoons or bears were most likely to find it. But my argument and what I know for sure keeps going through my head: this group was almost leaning on the bench, hunched over, and going through our bags and trash. What's more, when we all had to go out and check the area the next morning, there was no mess, no trash lying around, and no scene like what happens when animals come into camp. When I first saw it, my first thought was to run, so I slowly closed the windows and locked the doors. I watched this thing from about 15 feet away as it moved from one side of the camp to the other. It was a black mass and a pitch black forest. Even if I used my phone, I didn't have a flashlight. I was scared and shaking, and my friends were only a few feet away. Intense. I lay down, closed my eyes, and waited until light came through the trees. When it did, I sat up again, having slept for less than an hour. At 8 in the morning, I looked to my left and saw a huge bull. It walked around camp for a few minutes but didn't do anything. At first, I thought it was a cow because it didn't do anything, but the cow's hoof prints were clear, and I didn't see a cow that long. Not only that, but this person I saw was tall. I couldn't give you a number. It had a kind of skill that only a two-legged thing could have. I want to say that I can think of a million ways to make this a bear. I play it back and try to hear only a bear, but it just doesn't sound like that to me. I didn't see it as something else until now. I live in North Carolina, close to Asheville. I own a business that does landscaping and irrigation. I lived about an hour east of here. My parents had 30 acres of land that was surrounded by 6,000 acres of game land. All my life, I've played in the woods, gone hunting, and camped. I can also work outside because of my business. All year, I was setting up an irrigation system in a large, gated, wooded golf community in the North Carolina mountains, about 15 minutes from Asheville. About 300 square miles of forest join this town to the Pisgah National Forest. This happened in 2016 between April and June. I was in the backyard, facing the control box that is attached to the house. So I was facing the woods and maybe 30 yards from the tree line when I heard a loud crash. It was the same sound a big tree makes when it falls through other branches. I quickly turned around and saw a huge beech tree swaying back and forth. Its leaves were falling, but the tree itself wasn't falling. I've been in trees this size. I'm 6 to 250 pounds. I can't rock this tree like this, but I don't know what did it. I watched for probably 30 to 45 seconds, but nothing happened. So I went back to my work. Again, it happened. But this time it was a different tree, so I knew something was wrong. Bears don't move like that from tree to tree. So I walked to the edge of the yard and stood there for a few minutes, but the trees didn't move. Here, the tree cover is very thick. The only way I could have really seen what was hiding was to walk to the bottom of the tree and look up, but I wasn't going to do that. So I walked back to the control after a while. But I went the wrong way. Even though it seems silly, I felt like whatever it was watching me. When I got to the control, I turned to face it, then quickly turned back to the woods to see if I could trick or catch it by jumping. There was nothing. I went back to work because I thought the show was over. Then it happened again. A loud crash sent a third big tree shaking. I was so scared at this point. I ran to my truck and drove away. I just moved the job around. I've lived my whole life in the forest. Never been afraid. Bears don't do that during the day. They go up and down steps. Cats don't make loud crashes when they chase the first one, which they would have to do. What did this must have been very big. Even if I tried, I couldn't make those trees rock. Plus, it was watching me and waiting for the right time to jump so I wouldn't see it. Here, bears don't care much about being seen. They know that no one can hunt them in those places. You must get them to leave. This was a different thing. I wish I was brave enough to walk to the bottom of the trees, but I'm not. I'm afraid I'm not strong enough to handle myself. I always have a gun with me, but I couldn't handle this. I just remember hiking about 2 to 3 miles from our camp in Wenatchee National Forest and sitting on a bluff with a great view of the ridges around me. After sitting for a while and not seeing anything, I hear a series of heavy flooding noises that sound like someone walking. I didn't even know what it was. I thought it might have been a deer running away, but it didn't sound quite right. The thuds were so heavy and loud that they almost sounded like cartoons. Then, about 5 minutes later, I hear exactly what sounds like 2 rocks being hit together. I was still very uncertain about what the sound could be. It sounded like it was maybe 40 to 50 yards away, behind some trees and bushes where it couldn't be seen. I got up, got my gun, and went down to where the sound was coming from. When I was standing about 10 feet from the trees, I had the Sasquatch epiphany, so to speak, when I realized it might be a Sasquatch. All the hairs on my body stood up, and I ran back to the top of the bluff as fast as I could. I could still hear the rock hitting, so I got 2 more rocks and hit it 3 times with them. After a short break, I heard 3 banks back. I moved this thing back and forth for about 5 to 10 minutes. It would look like a lot of banks. I'd do bad things to banks. Banks got hurt by it. I did 4 bangs and so did it. I was too scared to keep looking, and it was getting dark, so I went back to camp and told everyone what had happened. There is only one way to get to that area, and no one had ever been there before. My friends thought it might be a bear snapping its jaws, but there was a pile of a deer's guts nearby. My brother had already shot earlier that day, so he wasn't hurt. If there was a bear nearby, I think it would have checked out the guts. Later, I had my dad stand about as far away from me as I thought the sounds were, and I had him bang 2 rocks. It sounded the same as before. I can't think of anything else it could have been besides a Sasquatch. We were the only ones who camped there. It was October 1997. I was on US Highways 2 and 41, just outside of Gladstone, Michigan, in the Upper Peninsula, on my way home from work. I got off work at 5, picked up my kids from daycare, stopped at the local sub shop, and then drove out of town with my son in the front seat and my daughters in the back. We had just left the city limits of Gladstone and were driving northeast on a 4-lane highway toward our hometown of Rapid River. When I saw what I thought was a hunter hunched down on the other side of the highway's middle strip, I pulled over. I was the only person going that way. In the other lanes, there were 2 cars going south. I told my son, "Look at that stupid hunter. Why is he just sitting there?" As I got closer. But as we got closer, the man, or what I'm going to call it from now on, stood up. It was brown, like the grass in October, when everything in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan turns brown. It took a few steps to get across the road. It was then on the opposite side of the road. As I walked by, it dropped its arms to its sides and walked into the woods. It was gone. I have spent my whole life in the Upper Peninsula. I am a logger's daughter. Many hours of my life have been spent in the woods. In the Upper Peninsula, I've seen bears, deer, wolves, coyotes, and almost every other living thing. I have horses, and this thing moved faster and with more grace than a horse at full gallop. My thoughts moved quickly. I saw this thing and tried to figure out what it could be. The only thing that made sense was that it was a Bigfoot. I can't describe how big this thing was, how long its arms were, or how fast it moved and disappeared into the woods, even though it was close to town. This area has a lot of bogs. There are no people here, but I did see the creature 2 days later. The local radio station said that someone had seen a Bigfoot on the same highway. The DJ laughed at the news report. This is why I never told anyone about it. I wish you were here when this was going on. I only know that every time I drive by that spot, I still think about the animal I saw there. I also know that I will die knowing that I saw one of nature's greatest secrets. The thing that happened around 5:15 p.m. on June 9, 2021. It started raining around 3:30 p.m. and stopped around 5 p.m., so I had to mow the grass. It was already too long, and I usually put it in my shirt pocket when I know I have it, but since it was raining, I didn't want to risk it getting wet. So I just put it back inside. I was going from the north to the south. Behind my house are a number of large farm fields. In between these fields are 3 large depressions in the land where a larger vehicle could be parked and no one would be able to see it. Our cart paths go from north to south and run along the bottom. As I was mowing, I saw a dark figure about 150 to 200 yards away in the corner of one of the fields. I stopped and looked, and I thought it might be. At that point, to the north, the neighbor might be checking his trail cams. To get a better view, I moved my loader to the woodpile, which is about 35 yards closer. Soybeans had just been planted in the field, so I couldn't use the mower there yet. At that time, the dark figure was just east of the trail. I was hoping it would cross the path of the trail cam, but it seemed to avoid the area. This dark figure was following the deer tracks that are 40 yards east of the trail cam. So I asked myself what I was looking at since it had just rained and who would be back there. I slowed them down and saw that there were mushrooms around the woodpile. I thought it might be a mushroom hunter, but the person was black from head to toe, and mushroom season is pretty much over by now. A large figure started to move across the second field, heading northeast along the path where the deer usually go down into a large depression in the field. I knew there was no way I could get my cell phone or binoculars in time to see it. So I sat there and watched it follow the deer track. Even though I knew it wasn't a black bear walking on 2 legs, I thought no one would believe me. It seemed to cross the field without any trouble, and was out of the field in about a minute and a half. When it disappeared into the chest-high weeds, I waited for about 5 minutes to see if it would come out on the other side or head into a large section of woods where there are several trail cameras. I also look at the tree line to see if someone might have left a car there as they walked out, but there weren't any. I have no idea what I just saw. After I finished mowing, I didn't tell my wife about it until I had a chance a few days later. We went back to the area on June 12th with our golf cart to see if we could find any prints or tracks. We were sad to see that the field, which was full of weeds, grass, and corn stalks, had been killed. It made it hard to find people's tracks. We also followed the path it took up to the biggest part of the depression in the field. Here, you can see where the animal trail goes in and out of the tall grass. We also drove the cart down the mud paths into the lower part of the depression. On June 13th, our 15-year-old son and I did a reenactment. He is about 5'11" inches and 235 pounds. We had him wear a black Adidas sweatsuit with white stripes and lettering. My wife drove him in the golf cart to the place where I saw the black figure. I sat at the back of the woodpile on my mirror and talked on the phone with my son while keeping an eye out for him. I told him to put his hood up, and we walked the same path 3/4 of the way through the field, all in black. My first thought was that what I saw on June 9th was much bigger and easier to move to the field than what my son saw. My son took a lot longer to cross the field because he was trying not to step on the newly planted soybeans and avoid the old corn stalks. He was close enough that I could see the white parts of his pants. I know that everything I saw was black. In May, when the farmer tilled the field, we saw less deer in the area, and in June, when we went for car rides, we saw even less deer in the area as a whole. I haven't told too many people because I don't want to be laughed at. My wife didn't really believe me until we acted it out. She even says that there's something black from head to toe back there that you can't miss. I just can't get it out of my head. On July 26th, around 11 p.m., my wife and I were fishing at night on a backwater of the Crane's Nest River in Dickinson County, Virginia. My wife's head hurt, so she went to bed to rest. And we heard something big walking through the woods, but we thought it was a bear or a deer because both are common in our area. About an hour after she fell asleep, we heard a loud knock about 50 yards up in the trees. Then, about 15 or 20 seconds later, another knock came from about 100 yards up the ridge. Both sounds were like someone took a 4x4 post and hit a tree with it. 10 minutes later, there was a splash that sounded like something 20 to 30 pounds hit the water. This woke my wife up. Large fish jumping at night is not unusual, but this was different after the splash. It hadn't been more than a few minutes, but there were 2 more knocks. They were closer than the first one. When we pulled up anchor and took in our lines to leave, we heard 2 more knocks. My wife said she heard them up on the ridge, but I didn't. All I heard was the sound of a large animal walking up the river in the same direction we were going, as if it were following us. When it got to a shallow cove, it would have had to swim. We stopped hearing the sounds of people walking. We've seen this animal before, but this is the second time. About a month ago, we had an experience where we heard a big animal moving around. When we were driving west that night, we heard big splashes in the water, as if something were being thrown at us. On Route 2 to 24, my brother and I were going about 60 miles per hour when 3 fire trucks from the Odessa Montour Fire Department came the other way with their lights and sirens on. They were responding to a call. Suddenly, this thing ran from our left side to our right side across the road. It was lit up by the headlights of fire trucks and our cars. I told my brother to stop. "Don't punch that child." At that point, we knew it wasn't a person or an animal. We were afraid that the first fire truck would hit it. We think the lights and sirens scared it and made it run away. It moved very quickly on 2 legs, leaned slightly forward, and took steps that we think were about 5 to 6 feet long. Since the road was about 30 feet wide. It was all black, from head to toe, and stood between 6 and 7 feet tall. It moved its arms and sides like an ape, as if to get going faster. Unlike when people run, when they pump their arms and fists to speed up. We knew because of this. It wasn't an individual. As it ran across the road, the animal didn't look where it was going. It seemed scared, like an animal. We went back to the site this morning, but there were no tracks there. At the time, the ground was hard and dry, and there was no alcohol involved. On July 9th, around 10 am, I noticed that 5 of my chickens were gone. There were a lot of feathers in the chicken coop, but no bodies or blood. I looked around the perimeter and found a very large footprint. I went back to the house and measured the footprint with a tape measure. It took photos of the measuring tape next to it. The length of the footprint was 18 inches, and it was 9 to 10 inches wide. Tim Thompson, an Ohio BFO investigator, called me on July 23rd, and he came out to investigate. On Jim's first trip, he found 4 more footprints close to the first ones. Jim said that the distance between the other prints was about 4 feet. On July 24th, at about 12:38 am, I heard a sort of yelping sound coming from one end of my property, and then I heard a quick answer. At night, the same kind of noise comes from the other end. Now, I get the creepy feeling that something or someone is watching me this evening on my property. I decided to go past the building for communication, as the leaves were still calm. I walked along the path, or another half-mile, where the power line crosses the river. From here, a 15-foot drop gives a nice view of the river below. As I got closer to this area, I saw someone down by the river who caught my attention right away. I saw a black person at the edge of the river, about 250 feet away. I thought it was strange because not many people hike off trail in the preserve, especially in the summer or late at night or past the communication building. As I watched this man by the river, I started to notice small things, like how his golden red hair looked in the sunset. At this point, I didn't notice anything else about her except her hair. I remember not understanding what I was seeing at all. Whoever was down by the river started walking upstream while moving the reed bushes with its arms. I saw its long hair hanging from its arm from shoulder to hand and thought it must have a big foot. I reached for my phone right away, but I didn't take my eyes off of the thing. That's when it noticed me, and the thing that scared me the most was that I couldn't see any details in its face. As we looked at each other, I ran away then. I kept running until I ran into a couple with their dog near the building where we talked to each other. I'll never forget how confused their faces were. When I came running around the corner, I really wanted to tell them about my experience, but I knew they wouldn't believe me, so I kept running. The next day, I went back to look for prints, but I couldn't go into the thicket because it was too dangerous. The thing didn't scare me enough to make me give up on everything. Instead, it has made me more careful, especially about what is going on around me. I worked out all over that area up until July 2019, when I moved to Arizona. I'll remember seeing this for a long time. I didn't want to send it in at first, but because so many people have seen it, I'm now sending what I saw. We were on County Road 200 in Liberty Hill, Texas, with my son. We got to the end of the road and turned right onto County Road 236. We were on our way to Killeen, Texas, at the time, and it was early in the morning. The car we were in had two small pieces of plastic on the front that made noise to scare away deer. I got them because my car was small and I wasn't sure if that would help. But since there are a lot of deer in this area, it was worth a shot. I'm not sure if what I saw scared me because of this. Just after we turned right onto the county road to 36, I thought I saw a gorilla on the left side of the road. It seemed to be upset. As we got closer, it ran across the road and climbed into a tree on the other side. At that moment, I saw the tree move wildly, with its leaves and branches swinging like it was very angry or like a strong wind had hit it, even though the day was calm. What jumped into the tree is the only thing that could have caused this. Because my son was with me, I didn't look up or stop. But that sighting has always remained with me as it was so unusual. I've seen gorillas in the zoo. It looked similar. I'd say it was about average height and was standing on its back links. As I got closer, in front of us, it ran across the street. I thought it would be taller than it was, maybe 6 feet. From where I was and what I could see, it was hard to tell how high it was. After this happened, I even looked around to see if any gorillas had gotten away, but I didn't find too many. This sounds like a story, but it is a very clear memory for me. First, thanks for listening to my story. Clay County, Kentucky, is where I was born. Since Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania, I have lived in several other states. West Virginia is next after Tennessee. My story takes place in 2008, when I lived on the border between Kentucky and West Virginia. In this area, the coal business is a very important part of the economy. Because of the exhaust from internal combustion engines, underground mining requires equipment that runs on batteries. I worked for a company that fixed the batteries that powered the machines. Each of these batteries weighed between 100 and 150 pounds. I got some batteries for one of the mines in our area, and started on my way. I went to Charleston. West Virginia sent me down Route 5, which took me to a very rural area. The road changed from asphalt to gravel to dirt. It was about 5 p.m., and since it was fall, the day was starting to end and night was coming. As I drove down the dirt road, I turned on my headlights. I was going about 15 miles per hour and was next to a small river on my left. I turned a corner and saw a low water bridge crossing the stream. A low water bridge is made of pipes that let water flow through them, and then concrete is poured on top to make the roads. These are always 1 lane wide and are usually right next to the water. I saw 3 or 4 deer and a few birds off to my right. A bear was on the left side of the bridge. I've seen a lot of bears where it worked, but only black bears that were between 300 and 400 pounds. But this one was very brown and had a lot of fur. I believed. What's strange is that I've never seen a brown bear in that area, and especially not one that big. It was hunched over and looking down into the water. I had about half of the window on the driver's side down. As I got close to it, I thought that wasn't a bear as I got closer. When I was about 5 yards away, it stood up and turned to look at me. I think it was at least 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide at the shoulders. I couldn't see a neck. I've never been this close to a big animal before. It was a color called brindle. There was a mix of brown, black, and gray. It had a pointy head and no hair on its face, which made it look almost human. It didn't look angry or dangerous, more like it was curious about me being there. The hair on its arms was about 1 inch long, and its hands were almost as high as its knees. Bears don't have hands that high on their knees. I ought to know. I've seen them up close enough to know for sure that they don't have hands. As I drove by, it looked down at me and my pickup, and I could see how big it was. As I passed it, I was within 5 feet of it, and it was going maybe 3 to 5 miles per hour. I don't remember a bad smell, but I've heard that that's common with them. As the end of the bridge got closer, I looked in my outside mirror and saw it turn and step off the bridge into what must have been about 4 feet of water, which didn't even come to its waist. I can remember thinking, that wasn't a bear. I watched it cross the stream and climb up the other bank with a hand-over-hand motion while holding onto trees. When I went back that way after giving birth, it was dark, and I couldn't find any sign of it. I'm now 71 years old, so a lot of time has passed. Up until recently, I hadn't told anyone about what I saw. I told my father-in-law about what happened. I told him it was okay if he didn't believe me, but to my surprise, he worked in that area and said, "There's something down there." People have said for years that they've seen a building made mostly of blackberry vines, which is what my brother-in-law and I found. We were looking for deer on a farm that had been abandoned for about 35 years in a place where coal had been mined. It was plenty, but not as much as it is now. When we found it, we were both on a path that appeared and went in 2 different directions around a ruined bank. My brother-in-law went one way and I went the other, but we both ended up at the same place. We got to the building. We were completely shocked when we saw it. It looked like an igloo and had a doorway. The walls were made of briars that had been woven together, and the inside looked like it had been mowed. We couldn't believe what had made it. At the time, we didn't know much about Bigfoot. No sane person would have been in that area fighting thorny plants and biting bugs to make something like that. Then, about a month later, the same brother-in-law and his cousin were walking out of a hollow near dusk when they heard the strangest animal they'd ever heard. They didn't try to tell anyone about it. People laughed at them. Neither of them ever forgot it or came home when it was dark. It wasn't until maybe 20 years later, when I saw a Bigfoot show with a similar structure, that Bell made the connection to what we also saw at the same time. Other people in the county had said they had seen things peeking in windows. 2020 summer. Year of quarantine. At the end of July, a friend and I went hiking along the Rio Chama. Even though we were right across the river from town, the train wasn't going. Most of the town was empty, and the campground was closed. We are seniors, so this was a short day hike. We took a pit bull mixed dog with us for part of the trip. We had to take the dog back to the car before we could get to the river. She got scared and nervous for no reason. Up on the mountain, my friend and his dog live. The dog is used to wild animals and has even helped a bear. Anyway, windows down and dog. Much happier. We went on our walk again. We had just crossed the river and were walking along the trail next to the bank when we heard a series of hollow knocking sounds. They were loud and clear, so they weren't woodpeckers or falling branches, and they kept happening in the distance. The sound of the knocks is lighter, like a hit on solid wood. The nearby knocks answered. We thought it would be best for us to leave the area. Now it must have happened in the summer of 2015, 2016, or 2017. I went camping with my son's Boy Scout troop in Pennsylvania's Moraine State Park, which is in Butler County. In the middle of the night, I woke up. I think it was around midnight, but I'm not sure. This had to have happened on Friday night or early Saturday morning. I was surprised by how quiet it was in the woods. A camper from season 10. I thought this was strange. Our tent was the one that was closest to the water. There were maybe 30 or 40 yards of trees between us and the water. I heard what sounded like a tree or rock knocking on the other side of the trail from where our tents were set up along the shore. The knocking went on for a while, and then other tree knocks came from two different places in the deep woods to answer it. The calls that were answered seemed pretty far away, but I could still hear them. The first knock came from our side of the beach and was the closest. This went on for a short time. The people who answered the phone never changed, but the knocking on our side of the tent kept getting closer and closer. I was surprised by how quickly the knocks moved down the shoreline. I mean that the source of knocks that was closest to us was coming toward our campsite and moving down the shoreline. Whoever or whatever was making the smell was moving pretty quickly for something that was out in the woods at night. The knocks stopped just as we thought the source was right behind us. The next night, Saturday, I woke up again, but this time the woods sounded like they always do and there were boats on the lake. I heard another knock pretty far away in the woods, but I only want to talk about the first one. On June 12, 2021, my family and I went camping near Lake City, Colorado. We've been to Lake City for a week every summer for several years in a row. One of our favorite places is Deer Lakes, which is off Highway 149 about 15 miles southeast of Lake City. We always spend a few nights there fishing, grilling, and watching animals. There are also 2 ponds in that area. The Upper Mill Pond is close to Highway 149, and the Lower Mill Pond is a mile or two down the road on the way to Deer Lakes. We stopped at the Upper Mill Pond of fish this time, but just below the pond, we saw a cow moose and two calves eating in the runoff creek. We almost always see moose near Deer Lakes. We were in the cab of our truck watching a moose when we heard what was definitely a wood knock. We didn't think much about it at first, until we heard another one. I was driving, which put me the farthest from the pond and the moose. My daughter was in the back seat on the driver's side, and my wife was in the front passenger seat closest to the pond and the moose. The girls thought the sound was coming from the pond, but I thought it was coming from the other way. Between two ridges is a valley where the pond and the road to Deer Lakes are. The tree line on the east, or pond side, is only about 100 yards from the road. On the west, or opposite the pond, the tree line is sometimes a few hundred yards from the road and sometimes not far at all. When we heard the second knock, my daughter and I got out of the truck to listen. She and I both think that the sounds came from west of the tree line. We waited and listened. After a while, we heard another knock, which seemed to come from a different place than the first two. A bit later, another car stopped to watch the moose. We heard another knock when they got here. A third car went by, and as it did, we heard another knock. My family and I talked about it, and we thought we heard about 8 to 10 knocks coming from at least 3 different places on the west side of the road. It was possible that more than one person was making the noises in the woods. For example, if one person knocked on a tree, another might have heard him and knocked back. That's possible, but that would make me sure it was a Bigfoot. Happened later that night after we heard the knocks up by Upper Mill Pond while watching moose. We planned to fish at the Deer Lakes, but our lines were too tangled. We did get to cook, though. When the sun went down, we left your lakes but drove further away from the highway and waited until it was very dark before we went back to town. For us to be able to see the stars. Just off of 149. On the way to Deer Lakes, there is a place where people can leave their trailers, so they can unload their ATVs. There is also a bathroom for the police force. There is where the stargates were left. We heard a knock from the east ridge of the mountains as soon as we got out of the truck and closed the doors. This line of trees is about 100 yards from the road. It wasn't completely black. Even though it was dark, we could still see the outline of a mountain against the sky, but we couldn't see any individual trees. I can't think of any reason why anyone would be up on that ridge at this time of night, when it is dark, cold, and windy. They were just waiting for someone to stop at the staging area, and get out of their car so they could trick them with a wood knock. At the time, I was sure there was a Bigfoot in the area. I'll be honest, I'm interested in Bigfoot. I watched every show on TV and videos on YouTube. I've been a part of more than one group, but I live near Amarillo, Texas, on flat, dry farmland where there's no Bigfoot hunting. But when we go to the mountains or a forest, I always keep my eyes open. But this is the first time I have done something that might help Bigfoot in some way. In a similar way, when my family and I visited Lake City and Deer Lakes a few years ago, we were getting ready to leave Deer Lakes. Before we drove back to town, I had to go to the men's room. So, my wife and daughter walked up the path from the lakes to the parking lot. They heard what they called a huge, loud, and sudden crash. An adult male moose was eating in the upper lake. When the accident took place, this moose was so scared that he ran out of the water and into the woods, which scared my whole family to death. When I came out of the bathroom, they were at the truck and asked me if I heard the crash. Somehow, I hadn't heard anything. When they told me what happened, the first thing that came to mind was Bigfoot pushing over a tree in the woods near the lake. We have no way of knowing for sure. The girls didn't want to go into the woods to look for Bigfoot, so we might have seen him twice at or near Deer Lakes. I'm almost positive. On June 12, 2021, we heard them knock. We appreciate your time. This evening, June 5, 2021, earlier. At Salt Fork in Ohio, 4 of us were in a boat. I live less than 10 miles away, so for years I fished and boated here. At 8 o'clock tonight, lake is very busy. There were several boats in the ski zone, so we decided to take a break and go back into a cove for a few minutes. When we were about halfway back into the cove, we all heard a sound coming from our back left, which is a very wooded area. It was loud enough to be heard over the car's engine. So we could figure out what was wrong. I turned off the engine. The only way I can describe the sound is that it sounds like an old mechanical tornado, or an air raid siren, that is just starting to get louder. The sound was very strange and had a low frequency, or bassy, that was very clear. You could almost feel the sound. No sirens can be found out here. I've never heard anything like that sound before, anywhere. We've all heard stories about Sasquatch being out here, but I don't believe them and usually make jokes about them every time I go out. I thought it was strange, but Bigfoot was not the first thing that came to mind when I thought about what we heard. After we got home and put the kids to bed, I looked up Bigfoot air raid siren on Google and eventually found the famous sound clip called the Ohio Howl. It sounds a lot like what we heard, but ours was closer. We camped near Julian, California, for a few nights. A few miles south of a town next to Highway 79. We got there on Friday night and stayed until Sunday afternoon. My wife and I shared a tent trailer with some friends, and both mornings before dawn, I walked over to the nearby porta potty to use the bathroom. Both nights were clear and quite dark, with only a little moonlight. The area has a lot of trees, so there are shadows, but you can see well enough to walk to the restrooms without a light. We walked to the bathroom without any problems the first morning. Especially in the evening, it is very quiet there. On the second day, probably around 5:40 am, I had to wait for my wife. I heard a wood knock very clearly. When my wife came out, I told her what I had heard and asked if she had heard it too. No, she didn't. We walked back to the tent trailer and went back to sleep because the sun wouldn't rise until around 7. After about 15 minutes, we both woke up and heard a single whoop sound, this time a little to the east. Right after we heard the sound, blue jays in the trees around us went crazy and made all kinds of noises for about 20 seconds. Then it was always quiet again after a while. Still before it got dark, I got up and kind of started a fire outside. I then decided to drive my car up the road to drop off some trash near the office of the campground. I told a friend who was camping with us at the time in a second tent trailer about the knocking on the tree when I got back from the quick trip to the trash man. She told me that she had also heard a tree knocking, but this time it was to our west. I heard 2 more whoops a few minutes later. From the southeast. Then a couple of minutes after that, to the south. These were not coyotes howling. I'm not sure what else to say about this, but it was interesting. At about 2:20 a.m. on August 26th. My 2 cousins were coming back from Mino in their car. They used back roads to get home more quickly. On Country Road 7, they were about 2 to 3 miles from home. They said that they were just talking when they saw a big hairy brown figure standing on the left side of the northbound lane. This figure was 7 to 8 feet tall. They said they were going about 50 miles per hour and slowed down a bit as they went by, tapping on the brakes and turning on the brake lights. When they saw it, they hit it back home. They said they were very afraid. They had to go at least 90 miles back home. As soon as they got to the house of one of my cousins, they got up and woke up. My uncle said that they had seen a Bigfoot. Then they drove to my house and woke me up, so I told them, yeah, right, like you've seen a Bigfoot around here. Both of them were scared and shook. So I knew then that they had seen something. So I took 2 5 million spotlights and a 3.5 million spotlight. My uncle also had $1 million light. We asked them to show us, and they both agreed. After they calmed down a little, we left their car and drove north in my aunt's van. They told us where it was, and I marked it by throwing a full bottle of water out of the window. I asked them, if you've seen more, which way do you think it's going? She thought it might be heading west. So, we went west on Country Road 6, just north of White Shield, about 1 to 2 miles from Country Road 7. We go north on Country and 5 and turn left. We were using flashlights to look at the cut wheat fields. I was in the back seat while my uncle drove. We were both looking around with our flashlights when I saw the bright red reflections of eyes. As I told my uncle to stop, I saw that this thing was on all fours and moving west toward us. Then it stopped moving and seemed to sit down. I mean that it looked like a movie gorilla. We stopped and sat there for a while. We had to have been looking at it for about 3 to 5 minutes. I couldn't believe it. But as I began to understand what was going on, I remembered that we don't have gorillas in North Dakota. When my uncle saw 2 more sets of eyes behind the one we were watching, my cousin started yelling and swearing at us to leave and call the police, game and fish, and other people. After that, we started to go back the way we came. When I saw that it was standing up, I said, quick, let's get up and get some game and fish out here. When I got home, my cousin had already called the BAA. They said they would call the game warden, so my uncle and I told my cousins to tell them that we would go back down there and wait for the game warden. He or she stayed. My cousin's husband wanted to come with us. When we were about to turn onto Country Road 5, we smelled urine and old, sweet slough. We didn't do it. I looked at how the van smelled. There was a better smell than outside. We pulled over and got out, getting ready to listen. We saw the truck lights on Country Road 6 at that time. The game warden did it. We flashed him down and talked to him. We told him everything, and he said he would check out the field. As we talked to him, my uncle told us to try and call it. So, my cousin's husband made a howling sound, and sure enough, a faint bellow came back from about a half-mile southwest of us. There are no cows there, so we started walking in that direction and stopped where we thought the sound was coming from. We rolled down the windows and started listening for anything. Not even crickets, birds, or grasshoppers were tripping. So, we all went back and left. Stopped the game warden, and we said, let's look around until 7 o'clock in the morning. That morning, we saw that there was a lot of slough and tall weeds, which could be used to hide. When we started looking for prints the next day, we found marks in the cut wheat field and ditch. The tallest print was about 15.5 inches, and the widest was about 6 inches. We stopped to talk to a police officer and told him we had found some marks. He went out and took some photos. As we followed the footprints, they started to go in a zigzag pattern and point east. We also found 3 other sets that seemed to be going in different directions. After 30 minutes or so, we tracked it to a row of trees where there seemed to be piles of cut hay and pine tree branches too thick and broke off. The break still has sap coming out of it. There is either a sunflower or a tall weed growing there. Around that spot, there were no tall weeds. So we walked around and found a slough at the end of the row of trees about 200 yards away. The weeds gave me the same stems. On August 31st, my uncle and I sort of figured out where we were going. It looks like they follow small streams and ponds, maybe to get water to drink. The way they were going led them to Lake Sashakawea. We tested this theory when we were west of White Shield and heard a small scream. Then a dog from a farmhouse started to bark, which led us to the spot where we'd seen it before. We listened. Our idea was right. We left them alone for a few days, so on September 4th, we went to where we thought they should be. They were not there, though. So that was the end of our searcher hunt until September 9th, when 6 kids saw a tall black thing running on 2 legs west on BA1 about half a mile north of White Shield. I talked to the kids myself, and they told me that it was running in the field, that it was black and walked on 2 legs, and that it took 3 steps to get across the road. It was about 9 p.m., and the sun was going down. When the kids said it was dark, my uncle and I went back there, but we didn't find anything. This is September 10th, the next day. We also looked for places where this thing had been. We are still looking for signs or even better prints. So long for now? My book, Ninth Set of Gold, was written with the benefit of hindsight. It's about the times I met Bigfoot while I was mining for 8 years in the Santa Lucia area of Southern California and the lagunas near Julian in San Diego County. I've been looking into claims that Bigfoot lives in these mountains, in the desert below, and especially on some Indian reservations. In 1981, in February, I'm in the right place at the right time. I met a young native boy who was very interested in Bigfoot and didn't hide it. He had seen big-footed head on the reservation and knew where the caves were where he lived. I could go there with him. He led me up a scary road that had been damaged by a storm. My old van wasn't made for this, and I'm too old to handle it, but once I started, I couldn't stop. Disaster seems certain, but I would die trying. My guide said that we had reached a small flat park. We walk down a canyon now. I walked quickly ahead until I found him sleeping under a bush below me. A small stream went around the bend, following a dark canyon. In less than a mile, I parked in bright sunshine. We were now in the dark caves over there, but I wasn't going to go in until my guide refused to go into a forbidden area. I didn't really believe what he said. I knew that no amount of money or other incentive could get a native to go into taboo ground. Okay, let's wait, sit down, I told him. Why do we have to wait? He wanted to look. At this time of day, he goes outside and walks around. He drinks from those old troughs made of rock. You could see it from the road. He sometimes stops by that broken down house where the road loops and makes you want to go fast. I told them no, but I didn't want to drive back down the road in the dark, so we walked back to the van, which was hidden in the brush until you got to the road. When I left the rest, it was getting dark. After a week of storms, I set up my native escort, who was neither friendly nor talkative, unlike before. Then I was told that my people aren't upset. The person who speaks for our tribe is very upset. You can't come back with or without your friends, and people who break the rules risk getting shot. So I gave up for a while, but I didn't give up. During that time, I planned to come back. A friend asked a well-known Native American for permission to drive up the mountain just to take pictures, so that they could stay on the road and not wander on the reservation. I had looked at the map carefully, but something told me to ask. We never change our minds. After making a sharp turn, a heavy pickup truck and a parked bulldozer blocked the road. 5 natives stood back to back in front of us, turning the road with their backs to us. It looks like we're in trouble, said Escort in a quiet voice. He came out with a cheery greeting, and 2 men came up to me because they knew I worked for the Forest Service. This morning, you see Bigfoot. They knew my name. No, and I just wanted to shake his hand when I came up here. That made everyone laugh, which was nice. I have seen him. From the canyon below the flat, he comes up. You just passed? He doesn't come out much. What my first native guide had told me was confirmed by this. The sticky situation was made better, but not so much that it would be worth continuing to look into. Right now, I'm waiting for the right time to come back. I was hunting deer with a friend I've known and hunted with for a long time. At about 9:15 am, I was in my tree stand. I looked to my left and saw a shape coming out of the trees. Then I figured out it was Scott. I knew something was wrong with him because his skin was very pale. He was coming up to the ridge very quickly and was always looking back. I told him I thought he might have been startled by a big buck, but he quickly told me that wasn't the case. Scott stopped at a stump to catch his breath and turned around to look behind him again. At this point, I began to worry. I've never seen him so scared. When he finally got to my stand, he was clearly very upset. I got off my stand and asked him what was wrong. He told me that something was wrong, which made me laugh. He told me that something was following him and that it made him very upset. It then started following him in a very aggressive way. Then he stood up to see what was walking around him. Suddenly, he heard a horrible, terrifying scream that shook him. He got his things together and went to my stand. We talked about it, and since we were camped about a half-mile away, we decided to check it out. We found some very disturbing things, trees that had been cut in half when they were 9 to 10 feet tall, and some very deep holes that were 12 to 14 feet deep long. That wouldn't be a big deal most of the time, but it hadn't rained in a while. We followed the tracks for 2 miles, until they disappeared into thick brush. I thought this was because I had the jitters, but the next day I was also stopped. I'm 67 years old, a former private pilot, and a retired nurse. I have excellent vision 2015. So I was not mistaken. The thing wasn't a bear. We've had a bear near our deck, so I know what they look like when they stand up to get to the feeder. The sun was shining. My small Chihuahua mixed dog was in her cage out front. She was making noise. So I went to the front deck and looked toward the dirt road where she was looking. We are about 125 feet away from the road. I saw a black shape that looked like a person walking on two legs by our driveway. It was half bent over, and then it stood up straight. It had long arms, swinging. The head was turned away, and the neck around the head looked very short. I thought to myself, that looks like a chimpanzee. I looked at it for about 12 seconds, until it went behind some trees. Going east, there are places where I can see the neighbor's driveway through the trees. So I was looking for it to either go up to the drive or keep going on the road. When it didn't, I took my air horn and walked about 200 feet to the end of the driveway. For a long way, there is nothing on the road. In the afternoon, I took my small dog to that area. She wouldn't even walk, and she was shaking. This was the same dog that almost went through a screen door to attack a bear by our feeder. Just a few weeks ago, I saw a patch of bent weeds where the animal must have come out of our woods, gone into a small ditch, and then come back up to get on the road. It then walked past our driveway on the roadside in the direction I saw it go. There were 3 12 inches long, barefoot depressions with faint toe marks. The area was dry and had fine gravel, so there wasn't a clear print. A week before, I heard twigs breaking and weeds moving behind my fenced garden. This is about 40 feet from where I often sit on the front porch. The dog barked. The noise stopped and then started again, so I blew my air horn, which I always have nearby after seeing a big coy wolf. About 100 feet above the river is where the cabin is. There are many trails for snowmobiles and ATVs. Also, the long trail is only about 1/5 of a mile long. It was far away, and had a lot of trees. There were a few houses and camps on our way. We camped in the Cleveland National Forest Mountain Laguna area east of San Diego with my wife. Burnt Ranch Era is the name of the campsite. It was 3:14 a.m. to the minute. My wife got me out of bed. She had to go to the bathroom right away. She was afraid to go alone to the bathroom, which was about 50 yards away. As I was putting my shoes on, I started to hear sounds that sounded like an axe hitting wood, but louder. It wasn't like someone was cutting wood, since the sounds didn't come quickly after each other. 2 or 3 seconds went by between them. I think I heard 4 or 5 of them all together. I put on my shoes and left my tent, but I could still hear them. Finally, they realized that they sounded like the knocking sounds that people who have seen Bigfoot have said they have heard. They stopped after about 5 seconds. I don't know if I made this up or if it really happened. I started to hear voices repeating themselves. I say voices because it sounded like someone was talking, but it was also nonsense. The next day, my sister-in-law, who was camping with us, started to yell at us about how loud we were and how often we got out of the tent to use the bathroom. I asked her if she had heard the sounds of knocking, and she said she had. She said that they were like a heavy rock being dropped on plywood. I asked my wife if she had heard them, but she said she was still half asleep and trying not to pee herself. I've seen the show Finding Bigfoot, so I know what sounds people say Sasquatch make, but I never thought I'd hear them for real. As best as I can remember, this is what happened. I'll only use the initials of the people involved, but there were many of them at the time. You can do a story/report on this. Regardless of how in 1971, in the fall. When I was in high school, the high school football homecoming was coming up. Some of the students were at Addresses Ranch getting ready for a homecoming float when some members of the Oklahoma high school football team drove up to the barn yelling and screaming that they had seen something in the woods on Green Hill Road. Even whatever it was, they said, it was bigger than E.S. It grabbed him while he was going to the bathroom in the woods. E.S. played football. He was taller than 6 feet 3 inches and weighed about 245 pounds. Yes, a very big man wouldn't get out of the truck. Once they reached Dresser's barn, he was as pale as a sheet and looked like he was in shock. Ian was shaking so much, and he was another football player. He couldn't do anything by himself. Several other football players said they were there when it happened, but all they saw was S running back to where the fire was passing them and locking himself in the truck. Ian jokingly got his flashlight out of his truck to shine it where E.S. had come from. Ian was holding the flashlight in one hand and trying to take a picture with the other. Ian said he'd seen it, a big, hairy animal standing about 20 feet away from him. The letters E, S and EN, we were the only ones who saw whatever it was. But they were so convincing that the other people there got in their cars and drove to town, which was only about 5 miles away since one of our teachers was with us at Dresser's barn. When they told us what had happened and then went there first, we thought they were messing with us. But once we've seen the faces of the S and E, N, we thought that there must be more to it. So we all jumped in our trucks and cars and headed out to Green Hill Road to see if we could see anything ourselves. Since there was a long line of cars and trucks leaving town at the same time, the local police saw us and called the highway patrol and county deputy. They thought we were up to no good. When we got to Green Hill Road, a few of us had flashlights and shone them into the woods where he'd been taken. We didn't notice anything that didn't belong. The highway patrol and the county deputy then came to try to get us to leave. No one asked them what was going on. So S and Ian told them what they had seen after that highway patrol trooper and deputy sheriff went out into the woods to look around. A few minutes later, they both went back to the group of high school students who were waiting and told us to leave if we knew it was good for us. They neither said they saw something nor said they didn't. The next day at school, we all left to go back to town. Most of what people talked about was the Green Hill Monster. In the afternoon, many of us went back to Green Hill Road to look at it in the light of day. There were 3 deer found. Then the guts were ripped out. There were no bullet holes in the deer, and they were all whole except for their guts being ripped out. While training, as an infantryman at California's Camp Pendleton, we dug in on a big hill, and we were waiting for the enemy to attack during the night. I was with one Marine until I left, and there were 2 more about 30 yards away. They, too, had dug in. In front of us was a steep area with lots of rocks. We heard something coming up the side of the mountain, and we could hear rocks rolling down the mountain. When it went over the edge, the Marine who was with me yelled, "Stop!" It stood up about 6 feet in front of us. I could make out the shape of this huge creature. It looked like it was about 3.5 feet across. Its head was pointy and its arms were long. From where we were, it looked very tall. I almost had to look straight up to see it. It was so big that I couldn't believe it. It was so big, wide, and tall. I could see the shape, but I couldn't tell what it looked like. It didn't make any noise, and we couldn't smell anything. After about a minute of standing there, it walked between us and the other Marines. I was so scared at the time that my hair stood on end. I try not to take in air. I didn't know what to think about it. After it had gone by and was no longer visible, we made sure that all 4 of us had seen the same thing. Everyone said that they wouldn't say anything. I have never told anyone about this before, but I know they are out there. Back in the 1970s, when my dad went deer hunting, he worked for the Green Lake County Sheriff's Office. Some hunters had seen a Bigfoot near Manchester, Wisconsin, so the sheriff's office and some people on snowmobiles went looking for it. They never did find it, but they had a lot of photos of the tracks in the snow. My dad showed me the pictures on the bulletin board in the meeting room. My girlfriend and I were in Eagle Rock, Virginia. We were in a graveyard on a ridge top. Day 24 of the year. At about 4:50 p.m., it was a cloudy, rainy day. We were visiting the graves of people in my family, when all of a sudden, we heard a deep, guttural call coming from what I think was about 150 yards away, if they were that high up on the mountain. It stayed low for a few seconds. 3 different calls were made. My girlfriend looked at me and asked, "What was that?" during the first call. When it called out again, 3 times in a row, she asked, "Is that a Bigfoot?" To which I replied, "I'm not sure." And I told her, "I'm not sure." I grew up in the woods, and I've heard a lot of things, but I've never heard anything like that. Her eyes show that she is scared. I looked around and told her, I don't know what it is, but look at all the dogs. They know exactly what it is. Over the ridge, about 100 yards away, there was a very large dog that was standing still and staring in the direction of the sound. There were two other dogs on the porch of a house, one of which was on a chain, and a hunting dog on a chain about 75 yards from us both. Both dogs stopped moving and looked in the direction of the noise. None of the dogs got excited. Even though it was close to the sound, the hunting dog was still quiet. My girlfriend said, "What do we do now?" Before she finished saying those words, I tried to make the same sound back at whatever it was, but I only did one general call instead of three. She said, "Oh my gosh," after I called, there was silence for about 10 seconds. Then it answered with a single one, just like I had. I thought I heard something moving, but then a rooster started crowing right behind us, and it and some chickens ran down the hill behind us. My girlfriend wanted to leave and go to my grandfather's, which sounded like a good idea. But I wanted to find out if I could get close enough to see what it was. I was able to persuade her that we would be safe in the car. So, we got on the gravel road that led up the mountain to the water tank, which was not far from where the sound had come from. When we passed the dogs on the way up, they were still and looking up the mountain. When we got to the water tank, they were still and looking up the mountain. I wanted to leave, but my girlfriend told me not to. I listened to her, and I'm glad I did because I had nothing to protect me. I had the windows down so I could listen for it. It was quiet, and then the dogs started barking at us. I knew then that whatever scared them must have left. So we left the dog that was just standing there. When we went by, it was up the hill and flipping and spinning. He was trying to get into our car so fast. When I went camping at the lake without permission 2 years ago, I didn't see anything but heard a lot. We were walking near the seasonal creek that flows into the lake from the southwest. El Nino rains caused the lake's water level to rise, and the creek that ran out of the lake filled the dirt road with about 2 feet of water. 3 of us were coming down from climbing Boundary Peak when we had to take our shoes off to cross a muddy, sandy bottom. Our footprints were clear and easy to see. But near the other side, we saw a set of footprints that looked like someone had walked into the water and then back out. The size of these tracks was about the same as ours. But they were blurry and had marks that were kind of fuzzy all over. They weren't there when we went by the same place an hour earlier. We all agreed that they looked strange. As we sat around a campfire that night, a US Border Patrol agent came over to talk. He had been dragging some old tires along the dirt roads near the border so that he could come back later and see if any illegal immigrants had crossed the border. We told him about the strange tracks we had seen, and he said, "Oh yeah, we call him Littlefoot because the prints aren't big enough to be a Bigfoot. But no one has seen him." The agent went on to say that everyone in this office just thought it was a Mexican with hairy feet. I was in Crew Junior High when I was in junior high school. It is no longer there. After playing junior high basketball with my teammates, I was on a back road in Greensville on a school bus. We had already lost. So, everyone on the bus heard it from my coach. He didn't want to talk on the way back to not away. Well, most of the people on the bus were sleeping. We can't talk, so we're trying to go to sleep. I saw it at that time. A cornfield with a scarecrow on a wooden cross in the middle was between 75 and 200 yards downhill from the road. I saw, through the foggy window, what looked like a big man with hair all over him. It was early winter. I could tell it had hair because the fur under its arms was thick and long. It had to be about 8-9 foot tall. Its head was at its chest area, and the scarecrow of the wooden cross, it was huge, massive. It appeared to be looking at the scarecrow as the bus drove by. I sat up in the seat trying to get a better look out the window because I had the window cracked to get some air. I yelled at my coach and everybody on the bus, "Did you see that?" They all laughed and joked on me. I tried to get my coach to turn around and go back, but he was so mad at the team for losing the game. He just told everybody to be quiet and not say another word or we would be running laps the next day. So I didn't say anything. What I saw that night has haunted me for a long time. Until today when I got a text message from my brother about an article he read from you guys. It was a Bigfoot sighting near the Brunswick counties. My brother knows of the stories that I've told and wanted me to know that I'm not the only one to have seen something like this in my own hometown area. I live now in Virginia, but where I live now is only about 45 minutes away from where this happened, where the story of the Fort Pickett sighting, my brother had read happened in about an hour and 30 minutes from Greensville. I'm an investigator here in the mountains of western North Carolina. Having lived in the mountains all my life, I've enjoyed hunting, hiking and mountain things since I was a boy, so I'm very comfortable with being in the woods and for years have taken late night drives to go see wildlife. For the past few years I have been taking late night drives to my research that are good weather nights. It was Tuesday, 2015. The weather was good. I decided to take a late drive to my research area. I was still on the main road, taking my time, and within 5 miles of my destination, I was not really thinking about Sasquatch, but just enjoying the late night drive and some music. As I was rounding a slight turn on the road, I see a coyote on the right side. I slowed slightly as my eyes panned back to the road, and then I saw to my left the creature just left off the road and behind the guardrail. My truck's side lights hit it just briefly where I can get a good look at it. My setting was brief, but I did get a very good look at it. I cannot believe what I saw. I went up the road, and turned around as I caught me off guard. I did not even think to stop. I was trying to talk myself out of what I saw. Could it have been something else? The area on the left was very green, so I thought I might have seen something else. Maybe. As I approached the area, I stopped and searched up and down for anything looking reddish-brown in color, since it was June in the mountains. Everything was very green, but nothing was brown at all, bringing proof to me that it was a creature that I saw. It's very hard to describe the feeling that I had at the time of the sighting and after. I was feeling very strange and could not believe what had just happened. This is what I saw. Just past the guardrail and slightly off the bank of the road, a reddish-brown upright figure. It had its back to me, and I could see from the back and upper legs behind the guardrail. I'm very sure it was on two legs, but the most impressive with the shoulders were very large. The head slightly forward, with no neck-type look the waist. His shoulders made a very impressive V, larger than any man I've ever seen. The hair was slightly long and had another color of grey-white underneath it, with a main coat of reddish-brown. Some of the back hair was shaggy looking. The left shoulder was slightly up and the arm was curled. The sighting was brief, but I got a very good look at it and I could tell it was very tall. After turning around and checking the sighting area for my truck, I pulled off about 150 yards down below on the side of the road. I got out of my truck to listen for about 10 minutes. Then I did a howl call, immediately getting a response from a pack of coyotes. They were very close and below the road, about 150 yards away. This would be the side of the road. The creature was also on. I tried driving back up the road to see if anything was there, maybe about 100 yards above. When I saw the creature, I saw wild boar feeding on the side of the road. Later on, I stopped at an overlook about a quarter mile past the sighting and made yet another howl call. I got another response from an owl being close to the parking lot. Then just after this response, I heard another alcohol in the valley below towards the sighting area. It was the loudest alcohol I've ever heard. I have heard many different alcohols, but this one was very strange. The volume of it was very strange as well. I stayed in the area for 4 more hours with really nothing happening. The next afternoon, me and a friend went back to the general area of the sighting looking for tracks. We only found disturbances as the ground was very rocky, steep, and hard. Not really friendly for walking around on. I cannot fully explain my feeling after the sighting. I really noticed that I was feeling strange, and when I got to get a drink a few miles away in the store, I noticed I was sweating and feeling odd. I think that I was slightly in a state of shock. I feel like this was due to me seeing something that I've not seen ever before. Something that was hard for me to process. I have been hunting in the woods all my life. I've seen every animal in our area in many situations. Trust me, I've not seen anything like this before. I've related this story only to very few people over the years, for fear of ridicule by my peers and doubt that anybody would ever really believe me. Anyway. In May of 1982, while serving on active duty at Camp Pendleton, California, I was temporarily assigned to a staff of Marines, supervising a youth program consisting of a rigorous series of 2-week-long mini boot camps for teenage boys. Camp Pendleton is flanked by the Pacific on its western flank and by the Cleveland National Forest on its northeastern flank. 3 different mountain ranges intersect the base itself. I am very familiar with every nook and cranny on its over 200,000 acres of mountains, ridges, ravines, canyons, trails, back roads and the likes. Anyway, on one particular calm night, after a long, grueling day of forced marches, displays and demonstrations, we took all 300 boys up to a bivouac site for the night. The site is situated open meadow shelf above the infantry training school at San Onofre, a 52 area. The boys were exhausted yet eagerly setting up their shelter halves. They began to get a little too loud, so I began to quiet them and bed them down for the night. The rest of the staff was situated about 35 meters away, up on a little knoll that overlooked the boys. However, I was not aware that the staff had already bedded down and then I was the last one up, except for Radio Watch, which was half asleep too. It had become dark, with exception of a bit of starlight which gave me a very good range of vision. Finally I succeeded in getting the kids in the sack. Then I stood for a few moments to ensure all was secure and that not one peep could be heard and none could be. As I turned facing west, looking towards the closest edge of the perimeter, I noticed a tall, dark, bulky figure standing 15 meters beyond the last 10 or 20 meters from where I stood. We seemed to be staring at each other, but it's hard to say. I cannot make out any facial definition, but I had a strong gut feeling that it was checking me out real good. Since I was the only thing moving around, I could feel my heart begin to pound in, my entire body felt like it wanted to anchor. There was no doubt somebody or something very odd and dangerous standing there looking at me. I mean, this thing was tall and wide at the shoulders. I used my peripheral vision to make sure I wasn't seeing things, but it only confirmed what I already knew. It gently and slightly moved its upper body left and right ever so slowly as though looking around to its front, surveying the area. It was an easy 8 foot tall, like I mentioned previously. All I can make out was its massive silhouette, no real detail features. It had very broad shoulders, little to no neck, dark, and looked very powerful. I decided to go get a flashlight out of our vehicle on the top of the knoll and let staff know what was going on. I began to cautiously and quietly step backwards to prevent whatever it was from charging or coming. I continue to keep an eye on the dang thing, which just remained in the same spot. Almost halfway up the newel, I had finally lost sight of it but continued to move slowly, still trying to locate it from atop the knoll. It was very difficult to see anything clearly, at least outside the fringe of perimeter due to the light, or lack thereof. I walked back down to the tents, scanning the area with the light, but didn't see anything like I had before. The figure had obviously moved. So instead of waking anybody up, I sat up for a while. I waited to see what and if anything would happen. I also hoped the darn thing wouldn't pop up behind me. We were all unarmed. It would have been worse and maybe a calamity if I'd pushed the panic button and waking everybody up. After all, we were in charge of nearly 300 young street kids without any formal training out in the open, and I didn't need the grief. If nothing I said or described could have been verified, thankfully, nothing else occurred that night in the morning. Just before daybreak, I beeline for the spot where I saw the things standing. There was nothing there, nothing, not a pole, a bush, a tree, a reed. I mean nothing that could have simulated what I'd seen. We were situated on a flat clear open ground with the exception of the knoll and a tree line about 60 meters away in a mountain behind, all of which I knew existed and had seen. Backdropped way beyond the figure the previous evening. The ground was grassy. It was already pretty well matted down and reeded by the constant foot and vehicle movement in that training area. I know that what I saw was not normal. I knew it wasn't a host. I know it wasn't the kids, they were well accounted for. I trust my judgment. I'm now 46 years old, still having perfect vision. I know it was not any of the staff. I had seen all of them sleeping when I got uphill. At the time I had nearly 11 years of active military service in the infantry and had done plenty of night P.S. observation posts to know how to use my eyes in the dark and to know the difference between a bush and a moving object. This was big and real. Oh. And this thing was very quiet. I never once heard it make a sound. Surely after lying down for the night during a backpacking trip and the Nantahala wilderness, we heard a loud howl that lasted around 15 seconds with the change of tone for the last few. This howl could not have been mistaken for any other animal, and sounded very similar to recordings of other house. In the next 2 hours, we both heard random whoops. The next day while hiking we came across very interesting signs along the trail. The first was spotting what looked like a game trail that crossed the hiking trail. Upon closer inspection, the tracks in the well-traveled trail clearly were not made by a bear or any other four-legged animal. The footprints on the trail had left deep impressions where the heel contacted the ground, and footprints much larger than my foot were also seen. The distance between the tracks was approximately 5 foot on average, and the depth of the tracks where the heel had sunken down was 3+ inches. The ferns and weeds in the trail that had been pressed down were still green and flat, which made me think the tracks had been made with the past couple of days. I follow the trail in both directions for around 150 yards, the footprints remained consistent in both directions. After traveling the hiking trail further down the ridgeline for close to a mile, I spotted another trail that crossed the hiking trail. The footprints here were identical to what we saw at the first trail. I took pictures to gauge the depth and length of the prints. I found a stick on this trail that had blood on it. I regret not keeping it for evidence to see what type of blood it was. The location of both trails had some similarities. Both were located in the gaps along the ridge line, and there was an unusually high amount of limbs and trees wedged in tree forks on both sides. One of their strange observation made along the trail was finding 3 large white mushrooms placed upside down near the trails. One of these was on a rock and another was found on the trail while following the footprints. The area where we found these signs was the direction we had heard the house the night before. My friend and I had been searching for a place called Deacon Quarry and Deacon Maryland, and had just located it on a map. We had to park next to the aqueduct on some railroad tracks and walk through thick bushes and weeds to get to where the quarry was. It is in the middle of some trees. It's about 75 yards long and 30 yards wide, and the cliffs are very high. Between 50 and 80 feet tall. In certain places. However, there are a few places where you can walk down to the water. As we got closer to the quarry, we heard this very loud, screeching sound coming from about 25 yards away in the thick brush. It was very loud, and when it started, it actually scared us. The sound could only be described as sounding like a pig being killed. We stopped moving and waited, but nothing happened. It didn't matter. We kept walking until we found the quarry. Several more times, we heard the strange sound. Always coming from somewhere different. We did a survey and found a place to sit by the water and rest. As we walked around the quarry, we heard the screaming again. It was coming from the area where we wanted to go. We weren't too scared, but because we were curious and dumb, we went to the water's edge, sat down, and started looking around to see what was going on. I picked up a stick from the ground, took out my pocket knife, and started carving on it. There was a huge splash in the water all of a sudden. It sounded like someone just jumped in, but when I looked up, I saw ripples in the water or something. I had just jumped in because I thought a rock was falling from the cliffs. We began talking again. After about 5 minutes, we heard another splash. This one was bigger and a long way from the edge. So I asked my friend, "Did you add something?" He said no, and then he looked at me. We looked around to see if anyone else was there, but there was no one else. We talked for about 5 minutes before we heard another big splash. Neither of us saw what made it, but because the water moved so much, we figured it must have been something big. We started to think that someone was in the woods who didn't want us there. They wanted to frighten us away. But as we started to really think about it, we realized that no one could throw a rock that big and that far. As we were climbing up and out of the quarry, we made the decision to leave. Near where we had been sitting, we heard another splash. We got to the top, which also sounded very big, and started walking to the car. We had only gone about 20 feet when something crashed through the tree branches and landed very hard on the ground near us. It sounded like a rock worth 20 pounds fell to the ground. We both stopped walking, turned around, and took a good look at the trees. We didn't see anything, but we both stood there to listen. I can't remember a time when the woods were so quiet. When we started to walk, the things that were being thrown at us started to hit us with a lot more accuracy. I know I asked my friend what was going on. His answer was to tell me to leave, leave, leave. We started running, and the only real problem we ran into was a 10-foot wide creek. We had to walk across a log. I went first, and he followed closely. About 5 feet from me, something landed in the creek as we were halfway across the log. It had to be about as big as a bucket of paint. I couldn't tell if it was a rock or something else, but it was big, so I jumped for it and ran toward the ground with my friend right behind me. We aren't looking back. I've never been that scared before. But on that day, I worried that we might meet something outside of nature and die before we could tell anyone about it. Due to the dense growth of thorny bushes, it took us about 30 minutes to get into the woods. Our trip took about half an hour. We got to the car, and it wasn't until after the adrenaline wore off that we both noticed how much we were bleeding from running at full speed through summer brush. At the time, I didn't know that the rocks being thrown at us had anything to do with the screams to a Bigfoot. It sounds like a typical situation. Since then, I've only been back a few times, and only when it's winter and I can see 100 yards. I was 17 and had to be home by 11:30. I should not have left my girlfriend's house as late as I did. I wanted to get home quickly. Teal Hollow Road took me from Howell Hill Road to Teal Hollow Road. I was going fast down a long straightaway when I looked to the side and saw something. At first, I thought it was a deer or a cow, so I slowed down. As I got closer, it stood up. As I went by, I was still going about 55 or 60 miles per hour. I then thought it was someone whose car had crashed, so I stopped. I was done with it by then. I stopped about 100 to 200 yards away on the road. When I put the car in reverse to back up, I saw that I had walked into the road behind me. When I was about 25 to 30 yards away, I saw that it was much bigger than a person. Since it was dark, I couldn't say much about it, but it scared me. I threw the car in Florida and drove there. I went as fast as I could until I got to Highway 64. When I got home, I was still shaking and my eyes were still filled with tears. I do not know what I saw, but it was big. It looked to be about 7 feet tall and almost as wide as my car. It's been 20 years, and I still won't drive on that road at night. I get the shivers. Every time I think about what had happened, it scared me whatever it was. I was in my mother's kitchen with 2 of my nieces and my mother when I happened to look out her back door. I saw a very tall creature, about 8 feet tall, moving quickly on 2 legs through the weeds on the edge of her yard. I shouted, "What's that?" One of my nieces was standing near the door, also seeing the creature. After a few seconds of stunned silence, we all went into the backyard and saw the creature, which was now in the yard, run behind a storage building. I remember that everyone, including me, was very scared. We did not pursue. Whatever this was, it walked on 2 legs, was about 7 feet tall, and had very dark brown or black hair all over its body. The creature was walking at a seemingly rapid pace, its shoulders hunched as this thing was moving away from us. We couldn't see any features of the face, but the head looked round. We did not see this thing anymore and assumed it had stepped over a fence behind the storage building and proceeded into the fields and woods. We were surprised by how fast this thing was moving and how easily it seemed to get away from us. When it was first seen, the animal was probably only about 100 feet from the back door. From where it was seen in the yard, it was about 150 feet away. We were too shaken to look for tracks and were actually afraid to go into the yard for a long time afterwards. 25 years ago, 1979, I heard the most awful and terrifying screams for 3 nights in a row. We had just finished building a 2-story addition that is about 150 feet into the woods from the street. At the time, this area was thought to be suburban, but it was pretty rural. Along the street, there are homes built on lots that are about 3/4 to 1 acre. We own a few acres of heavily wooded land, and our house is set further back than most. The stretch of woods was about 1 mile long and 1.5 miles wide, with some farmland fields and 3 state highways on each side. At the time there were only 2 dead-end streets that penetrated the section of woods. The part on the west of the state park is split off by a country road. Several 100-acre lakes with lots of trees are close to this park. There are now a lot of houses in the area. It was July, and it was over 90 degrees and very hot. Every night between 2 and 3:30 a.m., the papers were very loud. A very loud howling scream would start from a long way off. As it got closer to us, the screams each lasted 30 seconds and happened every 1 to 2 minutes. You could hear bushes and branches being moved out of the way with loud crunching and breaking sounds and screams that got louder and more intense. At the time, thick vines and bramble that were about 5 feet high covered the woods. It was hard to walk through any part of the woods that hadn't been cleared. You didn't just wander through the woods, especially when it was completely dark. All the papers and night sounds stopped when this thing got closer. The sound was so loud that it made you stop what you were doing. I mean, your blood gets cold. I remember lying in bed and not wanting to find out what it was because it was big and I didn't want to know what it was. It wasn't a bear, a mountain lion, or a deer that was hurt. It sounded like a person, and like they were looking for something. It also sounded like they were in pain or trouble. It would go straight through the woods behind my house, about 100 feet away. On the 3rd night, I got up right away and waited for this thing to get closer. In the bedroom, I have a switch. I'd turn on some floodlights on the roof that would shine into the backyard. We did not have a deck or anything at the time. And the woods were about 25 feet behind the house. This thing was crashing through the woods, and when it was right behind the house, it let out a huge, loud moan. I was looking out the window with all the inside lights out and I turned on the floodlights. The scream stopped and there was silence for about 5 seconds, then it crashed through the woods away from the house very quickly opposite the direction it came from. You could hear the crash of a creature with 2 feet. I heard the sounds of breaking for about a minute more. Then it faded and was quiet. I was pretty spooked. So I went downstairs and turned on all the lights, including the ones outside. I saw that everyone in my neighborhood turned on their outside lights. This was strange. No one left their outside lights on, and this part of the street didn't have any street lights. There were at least 4 other houses that turned their lights on. I thought about whether or not to call the police. The next day, as I was mowing the lawn, my elderly neighbor across the street came over and asked, "Dave, did you hear the sounds last night?" "I've heard them a few nights in a row, and I almost called the police. I'll call them if I hear it again." I've never before heard anything like that. I did agree. And I was glad that someone else had told me about the event all these years later. I've only told a few close friends the story and the jokes I've made about it. But I still know for sure that what I heard was true. I forgot about it for a long time, until the early 1990s, when I saw a documentary about Bigfoot. When they played back a recording, it reminded me of the whole thing. It was nearly the same as the sound. I listened to the sound recordings on different websites, and they were very close to the recordings from Ohio or Pennsylvania. I have never seen or heard anything that happened after 1979. Maybe other people have told stories from this area. This report could be of use. I'm telling the truth. I didn't drink or do any drugs that didn't come from a doctor. I'm also the leader of a Bible-based church that doesn't belong to a certain group. I went for a walk in the woods because it was a nice day. After about 5 to 10 minutes of driving down the road, I heard 3 clear, deliberate knocks coming from 50 yards away in the brush to my left. I stopped right where I was. I've read about a lot of things on the Bifro, and I can't believe what I read. I calmed down and found a strong stick. I used it to hit a large pine tree nearby in the same way I had just heard. It took about 5 seconds, but this time the door was only answered by deliberate knocks. A few seconds later, another sound came from the same direction as the first one, but it was about 50 yards away. This sound was like when a big tree is hit with a stick and breaks when the stick hits it. It sounded like the stick was a couple inches across when it broke. 3 more times, I hit my tree, but nothing happened. I'd like to add that. As I walked down this path, I smoked a cigar. The wind was blowing in the direction from which the knocks came. I keep walking down the path, which brings me to the edge of a pond. As they looked into there, I have found something interesting. What looked like a 3-foot-long wooden club with a jagged end where the roots would be was lying on the ground. It looked like something you might see in a picture of a caveman. There were also 2 holes in the ground. One was next to a tree and was about 12 inches in diameter and close to 20 inches deep. The other was about 5 feet away from the tree and was only 3 to 4 inches in diameter and 5 inches deep. The club was lying on its side with the small end partially in that hole. I think this club dug both holes because the end was well rounded and full of dirt, but I don't know why I went back the next day to take pictures. I had a yardstick with me so I could measure these things. The next day, when I went back to the trail, I saw a big pile of poop about 15 feet from the tree I had knocked on. Nothing unusual. I also took a few pictures of different things that may or may not be important. Who or what was making those noises? I might never find out, but let's be clear about this. They were clear, well-timed, and meant to be heard. I'm sure.